I was drowning in my own lungs when my sister ripped the oxygen tube from my face. "Stop faking it!" Hannah hissed, her manicured nails scratching my cheek as she yanked. "You just want pity." The air vanished. My chest collapsed inward like a crushed soda can. I clawed at the empty space where the tube had been, my vision, swimming with black spots, my throat making sounds I didn't recognize, desperate animal gasps that echoed off the hospital walls. My parents stood 3 feet away. They said nothing. My mother crossed her arms. My father looked at his phone. I reached toward them, hand trembling, begging without words. "Help me. Please. I'm your daughter, too." Hannah rolled her eyes. "See, she's fine. Just dramatic as always." What none of them knew, what would unravel everything they believed about our family, was that someone was standing right behind them in the doorway. And 2 weeks later, at our grandfather's will reading, that man would place his hand on my sister's shoulder and speak 6 words that destroyed her entire world. "Have you ever been invisible to the people who were supposed to love you most?" My name is April Warren. I'm 35 years old, a healthcare consultant who helps hospitals streamline their operations. I've built a successful career in Denver, own my own condo, and manage my chronic lung disease with careful discipline. None of my family knows any of this because none of them have ever thought to ask. I grew up as the invisible daughter in a family that only had eyes for my younger sister. From the time I was 8 years old and Hannah was 2, I learned that my role was to be strong, self-sufficient, and undemanding. Hannah was delicate. Hannah needed extra attention. Hannah required protection from a world that might bruise her precious feelings. I was expected to handle whatever life threw at me without complaint because that's what big sisters do. Grandfather Charles was the only exception. When I was 12, he found me crying behind his tool shed after my parents forgot my birthday for Hannah's dance recital. He knelt down, wiped my tears with his calloused hands, and said something I've carried with me ever since. "April, you are a gem hidden in darkness. One day the light will find you." I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I think I'm only beginning to understand now. When Grandfather died 2 weeks ago, I drove 4 hours from Denver to Colorado Springs for his funeral. I stood in the back of the church while Hannah sobbed dramatically in the front pew, surrounded by relatives offering tissues and sympathetic embraces. My mother announced to everyone that Hannah had been such a comfort to Dad in his final days, while I had been too busy with work to visit. The truth was that no one had told me Grandfather was declining until 3 days before he passed. By the time I arrived, he was already gone. After the service, Hannah cornered me near the coat closet. Her eyes were dry, despite the performance she'd given minutes earlier. She leaned close, her perfume overwhelming, and whispered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Grandfather left everything to me, April. The house, the investments, everything. You should get used to that." She patted my cheek like I was a child. "Some of us were actually there for him." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell her that I'd called Grandfather every Sunday for 15 years, that we'd talked about books and history and the meaning of life, while she was too busy posting photos of herself online. But I said nothing. I never did. That was my role. The stress of the funeral, the grief, the altitude change from Denver, my lungs couldn't handle it. That night, I woke at 2 a.m., unable to breathe, my chest tight, as if someone had wrapped iron bands around my ribs. I called 911 and was rushed to St. Mary's Hospital, where doctors admitted me to the ICU and connected me to oxygen. When my family arrived the next morning, I expected concern. What I received was irritation. My mother stood at the foot of my bed with her arms crossed. "April, you always make everything complicated. We have the will reading to handle. Your father has to arrange the estate paperwork." Hannah examined her manicure. "She's probably faking it anyway. She always did love attention." I tried to explain that COPD wasn't something you could fake, that my oxygen levels had dropped dangerously low, but my mother just sighed and said they'd be back later after they handled more pressing matters. It was Hannah who stayed behind. She said she'd keep me company, but the moment our parents disappeared down the hallway, her expression changed. She glanced toward the door, confirming we were alone. That's when she ripped the breathing tube from my face, and that's when the door opened behind her. Dr. Marcus Keller stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, as he watched my sister step back from my bed. He moved quickly, reattaching my oxygen, checking my vitals, his hands steady and professional. But when he turned to Hannah, his voice was cold as steel. What did you just do? Hannah stammered something about the tube being loose. But I saw something flicker in Dr. Keller's eyes, something that told me this wasn't the first time he'd witnessed cruelty in this family. Dr. Keller ordered Hannah to leave immediately. She protested, claimed it was a misunderstanding, said the tube had simply come loose. But Keller's expression remained stone cold, and eventually Hannah grabbed her purse and stormed out, muttering something about ungrateful sisters and wasted time. I lay there trembling, my throat raw, my mind racing with questions I couldn't form into words. Keller checked my vitals twice, adjusted my oxygen flow, and told me to rest. But rest felt impossible when the person who was supposed to be my sister had just tried to suffocate me. The next morning, after the doctors completed their rounds and my family sent word they were too busy with estate matters to visit Keller, returned to my room. He pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down with the weariness of someone carrying a heavy burden. He asked how I was feeling. I told him the truth. Physically, I was recovering. Emotionally, I was shattered. He nodded slowly as if he understood more than I realized. Then he said something that changed everything. He told me that meeting me here was not a coincidence. He had known my grandfather, Charles Warren, for 5 years. Charles had been his patient, coming in regularly for heart checkups and eventually for the surgery that was supposed to give him more time. During those years, they had talked about many things: family, regrets, the people Charles loved, and the people who worried him. My name came up often. I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. Keller continued. He said that 3 years ago, during one of their appointments, Charles had made an unusual request. He asked Keller to watch over me if I ever ended up at St. Mary's. Charles knew about my lung condition. He knew that Colorado Springs was my hometown, that I might return someday and need medical care here. He wanted someone on my side. Keller remembered exactly what Charles had said. April is the granddaughter my family forgot. She has no one in her corner. If anything ever happens to her, please be there. Keller had promised, never expecting the day would actually come. Until last week, when he saw my name on the admission list. I couldn't speak. My grandfather had thought of me. He had planned for me. He had asked a stranger to protect me because he knew my own family wouldn't. Keller reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. He said Charles had given this to him 6 months ago, with instructions to pass it to me when the time was right. Inside were newspaper clippings, printed articles, pages from industry publications. All of them were about me. One article described how my consulting work had helped Denver Memorial Hospital avoid a financial collapse 3 years ago. Another featured an interview where I discussed efficiency strategies for struggling medical centers. There were dozens of pieces spanning nearly a decade of my career. In the margins and handwriting, I recognized from birthday cards long ago my grandfather had written notes. My granddaughter did this. So proud of her. She built this life completely on her own. The tears came before I could stop them. For 35 years, I believed no one in my family saw me. I believed I was invisible, forgettable, unworthy of attention or pride. But grandfather had been watching all along. He had collected evidence of my achievements like precious treasures. He had carried my successes in his heart even when he couldn't tell me directly. The realization broke something open inside me, something that had been locked away for decades. Keller gave me a moment to compose myself. Then his expression grew serious again. He said there was more I needed to know. Charles had confided in him about Hannah as well, and the picture was not pretty. My sister had made some terrible financial decisions 2 years ago. She had invested heavily in a business venture that collapsed completely, leaving her with nearly $200,000 in debt. She had hidden it from everyone, maintaining her lifestyle with credit cards, and borrowed money sinking deeper every month. Charles discovered the truth when creditors started calling his house looking for her. Hannah saw the inheritance as her only way out. She needed that money desperately. She needed it so badly that she would do almost anything to make sure she got it. Suddenly, Hannah's behavior made a different kind of sense. The cruelty wasn't just sibling rivalry or jealousy, it was desperation. She was a drowning woman grasping at anything that might save her, and I was standing between her and the life raft she believed she deserved. The door opened and a woman in scrubs entered. She introduced herself as Rosa Martinez, the night nurse taking over for the evening shift. She was perhaps 50 years old, with kind eyes and silver streaks in her dark hair. She checked my monitors, asked how I was feeling, then turned to Keller with a meaningful look. She said quietly that she needed to tell him something. She had been at the door yesterday when it happened. She saw everything. She saw my sister rip that tube from my face and stand there watching me choke. Keller asked if she would be willing to testify to what she witnessed. Rosa didn't hesitate. She said she had a 78-year-old mother at home. If anyone ever did something like that to her mother, she would never forgive them. She would absolutely testify. Then Rosa looked at me, and something in her expression shifted. She said there was something else I should know. She had worked at this hospital for over 20 years, and she remembered patients and their families. She remembered my grandfather. She was on duty the night he passed away. My blood ran cold. Rosa's voice dropped lower. She said that night my sister Hannah had come to visit. Late around 11, she insisted on staying with him alone. Rosa had thought it was sweet at the time, a granddaughter wanting private moments with her dying grandfather. But now, after what she witnessed yesterday, she wasn't sure anymore. "Your sister was there that night," Rosa said slowly. "Alone with him. And by morning he was gone." Rosa's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. I asked her to tell me everything she remembered about that night. She pulled a chair closer and spoke in a low, steady voice. She said my grandfather had been recovering well after his heart surgery. His vitals were stable. The doctors were optimistic he would be discharged within a week. Then Hannah showed up around 11 at night, saying she wanted to spend some quiet time with him. Rosa thought it was touching. She let Hannah into the room and continued her rounds. About 30 minutes later, the monitors started screaming. Rosa rushed back to find my grandfather had stopped breathing. She called the emergency team immediately, but it was too late. What bothered her most was Hannah's reaction. Most family members panic when something like that happens. They cry, they scream, they beg for help. Hannah just sat there in the chair by the window, perfectly calm, watching the medical team work on a man who was already gone. And there was something else. When Rosa checked the equipment during the chaos, she noticed the breathing tube had been displaced from its proper position. Not completely removed, but shifted just enough to compromise the airflow. She reported it to her supervisor, but there was no investigation. Elderly patients sometimes move in their sleep. Equipment shifts. These things happen. Rosa paused and looked at me with tired eyes. She said she had no direct proof of anything. She couldn't accuse anyone based on what she saw, but she knew something wasn't right, and apparently my grandfather knew it too. Because after Hannah's first visit to see him earlier that week, he immediately asked the nurses to contact his lawyer. He changed his will 3 days before he died. I turned to Keller and asked the question, burning in my chest. Would Hannah ever face charges for what she might have done to Grandfather Keller? Was honest with me. He said probably not. There was no concrete evidence, no witnesses to the actual moment, nothing that would hold up in court. The displaced tube could be explained away as accidental movement. Hannah would deny everything, and without proof, no prosecutor would touch the case. But Keller reminded me that Charles had known something was wrong. That's why he changed his will. That's why he had prepared for the possibility that Hannah might go too far. I lay there processing everything. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel sad or defeated. I felt angry, a cold, clear anger that sharpened my thoughts instead of clouding them. I didn't want revenge through the legal system. I didn't want to spend years fighting battles I couldn't win. What I wanted was the truth. I wanted my family to face what they had allowed to happen, what they had chosen to ignore for decades. I looked at Keller and Rosa and asked them directly, would they help me? Would they stand with me when the time came to reveal everything? Keller nodded without hesitation. Rosa reached over and squeezed my hand. She said she would be honored to help. The next day, my family showed up demanding that I check out of the hospital early. My mother complained about the expense. My father muttered about scheduling conflicts with the lawyer, and Hannah incredibly acted sweeter than she had in years. She sat on the edge of my bed and said she was so worried about me. She said I should come home and rest properly before the will reading. She even offered to make me soup. I looked into her eyes and saw the calculation behind the performance. She was scared, not of me, but of losing control of the situation. For the first time in my entire life, I didn't bend. I didn't apologize or accommodate or make myself smaller to keep the peace. I told her I would leave when my doctor said I was ready and not a moment sooner. Something flickered across Hannah's face. Confusion, maybe, or the first hint of fear. She wasn't used to me pushing back. I was discharged 2 days later, strong enough to walk on my own and breathe without assistance. Before I left, Keller handed me a sealed envelope. He said my grandfather had given it to him months ago with specific instructions. I was only supposed to receive it when I truly needed it. I opened it carefully and found a handwritten note in grandfather's familiar script. April, you are the only one in this family with a kind heart. Don't let them steal that from you. I read those words 3 times, feeling his love reach across the divide of death. He had been preparing for this moment all along. He had known what was coming, and he had made sure I wouldn't face it alone. The will reading was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Thomas Reed's law office downtown. When I arrived, my parents and Hannah were already seated, looking impatient and entitled. The door opened, and I walked in. But I wasn't alone. Behind me stood Dr. Marcus Keller and Nurse Rosa Martinez. Hannah's face turned white as paper. Hannah demanded to know why I had brought strangers to a private family matter. Her voice was sharp, but I could hear the tremor underneath. Thomas Reed, the lawyer, who had been grandfather's friend for 40 years, answered before I could. He explained that Charles had specifically requested their presence in his written instructions. This was not my doing. This was grandfather's final wish. Reed asked everyone to sit down. He was a tall man with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, and he carried himself with the gravity of someone who had witnessed many family secrets over the decades. He began by saying that Charles had been very specific about how this gathering should proceed. He wanted all family members present. He wanted witnesses, and he wanted certain truths to come to light before the distribution of his estate was finalized. Hannah sat with her arms crossed, still confident that everything would go her way. My parents exchanged nervous glances, clearly unsettled by Keller and Rosa's presence. Reed opened the first document and began reading. The main house, valued at approximately $800,000, would be divided equally among 3 parties: Linda Warren, Richard Warren, and April Warren. He paused. Hannah's name was notably absent. Hannah jumped to her feet immediately. She said there had to be a mistake. Grandfather had promised her the house. He had told her she would be taken care of. Reed looked at her calmly over his glasses and asked her to please sit down. There was more to come. Hannah's confidence cracked visibly, but she lowered herself back into her chair with clenched fists. Reed then turned to Keller and invited him to speak. My parents looked confused, but Hannah's face had gone from white to gray. Keller stood and addressed the room in his steady, measured voice. He explained that he had been Charles Warren's physician for 5 years. During that time, Charles had confided in him about his family, his worries, and his hopes. Charles had specifically asked Keller to watch over me if I ever needed medical care at St. Mary's. He had said that I was the granddaughter the family forgot, and he wanted someone in my corner. Then Keller described what he had witnessed 3 days ago. He had walked into my hospital room to find Hannah standing over my bed. She had just ripped the breathing tube from my face. I was choking, gasping, unable to breathe, and Hannah simply stood there watching. He intervened immediately and saved my life. He looked directly at Hannah as he spoke, and she could not meet his eyes. Rosa stood next. Her voice was quieter but equally steady. She confirmed that she had been at the doorway and witnessed the entire incident. She saw Hannah remove my breathing tube. She saw Hannah make no attempt to call for help. And then Rosa added something that made my mother gasp. She said she had also been on duty the night Charles died. She described how Hannah had arrived late, insisted on being alone with grandfather, and closed the door. 30 minutes later, the monitors alarmed. When Rosa rushed in, she found the breathing tube displaced, and Hannah sitting calmly by the window, showing no distress at all. Hannah screamed that they were lying. She said this was a conspiracy against her, that I had paid these people to destroy her reputation. Reed raised his hand for silence. He produced a folder containing hallway camera footage from the hospital and nursing notes documenting the displaced equipment. The evidence was clear. Keller stood again and walked slowly toward Hannah. The room fell completely silent. He placed his hand on the table directly in front of her and leaned close. Then he spoke 6 words that seemed to stop time itself. "I saw what you did, Hannah." She froze like a deer caught in headlights. Keller continued without breaking eye contact. He said it wasn't just what she did to me. It was what she did to grandfather, too. Reed opened a second envelope and explained that Charles had written a letter specifically for Hannah to be read only at this gathering. He began reading aloud. "Hannah, I loved you the wrong way. I loved you with silence and false hope. I thought if I gave you enough, you would learn to love others. But I was wrong. I don't know exactly what you did, but I know what you didn't do. You didn't love your sister. You didn't respect me. You only ever saw what you could take. If you're reading this letter, it means you still haven't changed. I hope someday you'll understand that love cannot be bought and forgiveness cannot be demanded. Hannah broke down, but not in remorse. She screamed that this wasn't fair, that she deserved that money, that grandfather had no right to judge her. My mother tried to defend her, saying Hannah was just impulsive, that she didn't mean any harm. Keller cut her off. He asked my parents directly if they had known Hannah had problems for years. The silence that followed was answer enough. My father finally spoke, his voice broken. He said they thought if they loved Hannah enough, she would eventually change. I found my voice at last. I asked them, what about me? Didn't I deserve to be loved too? Neither of them could answer. Reed cleared his throat and opened the final envelope. He announced that there was one more section in the will. Charles had reserved this portion specifically for me. He read the details aloud. The entire room went silent. Reed read the details of grandfather's final gift to me, and with each word, I felt something shift inside my chest. Charles had left me the mountain retreat house in Estes Park, a beautiful property valued at $400,000. He had written in his instructions that this was the place where I could finally breathe freely away from the family that had suffocated me for so long. He had also established a healthcare trust fund of $150,000 specifically designated for my ongoing medical treatment, ensuring I would never have to worry about affording the care my lungs required. And finally, he had bequeathed me his entire rare book collection, the same worn volumes we had read together when I was a child, spending summer afternoons in his study, escaping into worlds where daughters were treasured and families actually loved each other. The room remained frozen in stunned silence. Hannah looked like she might collapse. Her face had gone from white to gray to something almost green, and her hands gripped the armrests of her chair so tightly, her knuckles protruded like small stones beneath her skin. My parents stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes, suddenly fascinated by the pattern of the carpet beneath their feet. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the antique clock on Reed's bookshelf, counting the seconds of their collective shame. Reed reached into his folder once more and produced one final envelope, this one addressed to me personally in grandfather's handwriting. He handed it across the polished mahogany table, and I accepted it with trembling fingers. The paper felt fragile and precious, like holding a piece of grandfather himself. I opened it carefully, not wanting to tear anything, and unfolded the letter inside. His familiar handwriting filled the page, slightly shaky from his age, but still unmistakably his. "My dearest April," he had written, "you are the gem hidden in darkness that I spoke of so many years ago when you were just a sad little girl crying behind my tool shed. I have watched you grow into an extraordinary woman, despite everything working against you, and my heart has swelled with pride at every achievement you earned through your own determination. I am sorry I didn't protect you sooner. I am sorry I didn't stand up to your parents and demand they treat you fairly. I was old and afraid to confront my own children about how they had failed you. I told myself that keeping the peace was more important than speaking the truth. I convinced myself that things would get better on their own, that your mother and father would eventually see what I saw in you. I was wrong, and I will carry that regret with me into whatever comes next. But through this will I want you to finally know what I should have said out loud every single day of your life. I always saw you, April. I was always proud of you. You built a beautiful life despite every obstacle, and you did it with grace and dignity that your sister will never understand. Live for yourself now, not for anyone's approval, not for anyone's permission, not for the hope that someday your family will finally love you the way you deserve. The light has finally found you, my precious girl. Step into it and never look back. With all my love forever and always, your grandfather who adores you." I couldn't stop the tears. They fell onto the paper, blurring some of the words, and I didn't care. For 35 years, I had believed I was invisible and worthless to my family. For 35 years, I had worked harder, achieved more, and asked for less, hoping that someday someone would notice. Now I held proof in my hands that the person who mattered most had seen me all along. He had loved me. He had been proud of me. He had collected articles about my career and written notes of admiration in the margins, and he had found a way to tell me everything I needed to hear, even after death had stolen his voice. Reed allowed me a moment to compose myself before clearing his throat and addressing the room again. His tone became more formal, almost clinical. He explained that given the testimony provided by Dr. Keller and Nurse Martinez, I had substantial legal grounds to pursue a civil lawsuit against Hannah for assault causing bodily harm. The evidence was clear and well documented. I could also file a report with the police that might lead to criminal charges being investigated. The hospital had preserved the hallway camera footage. The nursing notes were official medical records. Combined with two credible witnesses, the case against Hannah was strong. Hannah's composure shattered completely. She leaped from her chair and rushed toward me, falling to her knees beside my seat like a supplicant before a queen. She grabbed my hands before I could pull away and begged me not to do this to her. She said she was sorry that she hadn't meant any of it, that she was under so much stress with her financial problems that she hadn't been thinking clearly. She said we were sisters, that blood was thicker than water, that families were supposed to forgive each other. She pleaded with me to consider what pressing charges would do to our parents, to our family's reputation, to the memory of grandfather himself. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup, and for a moment she almost looked sincere. I let her finish. I let her exhaust every excuse and justification and manipulation she had in her arsenal. Then I gently removed my hands from her grip and gave her my answer. I told her I would not sue her. I would not press charges. I would not pursue any legal action against her whatsoever. Her eyes lit up with relief, and she started to thank me, but I held up my hand for silence. I explained that my decision had nothing to do with forgiveness or mercy or sisterly love. I was choosing not to pursue legal action because I refused to spend another single day of my life carrying resentment toward her. She had already taken too much from me. She had taken my childhood peace. She had taken my sense of belonging. She had taken 35 years of believing I was somehow less worthy of love than she was. She would not take my future peace as well. I would not give her that power. But I also made something else very clear. From this day forward, Hannah was no longer my sister. I wanted no contact with her, no phone calls, no texts, no holiday gatherings, no pretense of family bonds that had never truly existed. She was a stranger to me now, and that was how she would remain for the rest of our lives. She would have to face her $200,000 of debt entirely on her own. She would have to explain to our aunts and uncles and cousins why grandfather had removed her from his will. She would have to live every day with the knowledge that the people in this room now knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of doing. Those were her consequences. They would follow her like shadows for the rest of her life. And unlike a lawsuit that might end after a few years, these consequences would never expire. Hannah stared at me with something between hatred and despair. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She had finally run out of manipulations. She stumbled back to her chair and collapsed into it, broken in a way I had never seen before. I felt nothing. No satisfaction at her suffering. No pity for her situation. Just a calm emptiness where the pain and anger used to live. My parents tried to speak next. My mother leaned forward with wet eyes and said she hadn't known things were this bad between Hannah and me. She said she was sorry that she never meant for any of this to happen, that she loved both her daughters equally and had always tried her best. I looked at her for a long moment before responding. I told her she had known. She had always known. Every time Hannah mocked me, and she said nothing. Every time my accomplishments were ignored, while Hannah's smallest efforts were celebrated. Every time I asked for help and was told to handle it myself because I was the strong one. She knew. She simply chose not to see, because seeing would have required her to act, and acting would have meant confronting Hannah, and confronting Hannah was something she had never been willing to do. My mother had no response. She just sat there with tears running down her cheeks, finally facing the truth she had spent decades avoiding. My father cleared his throat and asked if I could ever forgive them. His voice cracked on the question. I considered it carefully before answering. I told him I needed time, maybe a very long time, perhaps years. I wasn't cutting them off completely the way I was cutting off Hannah, but I was establishing clear boundaries that should have existed decades ago. If they wanted me in their lives going forward, they would have to prove it through consistent actions over time, not empty words spoken in moments of crisis. They would have to earn back the trust they had spent 35 years destroying. Whether they were capable of that remained to be seen. 3 months later, I moved into grandfather's mountain retreat. The house sat on a forested hillside overlooking the Rocky Mountains, surrounded by towering pine trees and clean, crisp air that my damaged lungs welcomed like a healing gift. Every morning, I woke to the sound of birds and wind through the branches instead of traffic and sirens. Every evening, I watched the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple. I set up grandfather's book collection in the study, exactly as he had kept it alphabetized by author with his favorites on the shelf nearest the reading chair. I could almost feel him there with me, nodding in approval. I began writing. Not for revenge, not to expose my family to the world or seek some final form of public punishment. I started writing a memoir about my journey because I knew there were other women out there who had been forgotten by their families too. Women who had spent their whole lives feeling invisible. Women who had been told they were too sensitive, too dramatic, too demanding, when all they wanted was the same love freely given to others. Women who needed to know they weren't alone and that survival was possible. If my story could help even one of them find the courage to walk away from toxic relationships, then everything I had suffered would have meaning. Keller became a trusted friend in those months. We met for coffee once a month at a small cafe in town, and he told me stories about grandfather that I had never heard before. How Charles had worried about me constantly during their appointments, asking Keller hypothetical questions about lung conditions and treatment options. How he had talked about my accomplishments with beaming pride to anyone who would listen, showing off those collected articles to nurses and receptionists. How he had spent his final years quietly putting plans in place to protect me, even after he was gone. Those conversations helped me heal in ways I hadn't expected. They gave me back pieces of my grandfather that death had tried to steal. One quiet afternoon in early autumn, I stood on the balcony, watching the last golden light fade behind the mountain peaks. I held grandfather's favorite book in my hands, a worn collection of poetry he had read to me when I was small, and the world still seemed full of possibilities. The binding was soft from decades of loving use. I opened it carefully to the first page and found an inscription I had somehow never noticed before, written in his handwriting from 20 years ago when I was just 15 years old. For April, my strong little girl, someday you will understand your own worth. I smiled. For the first time in my 35 years of life, I think I finally did. My phone rang, breaking the peaceful silence. I glanced at the screen. Rosa's number. I answered, and her warm voice came through with barely contained excitement. She said she had just spoken with a journalist from a major women's magazine who had somehow heard about what happened at St. Mary's Hospital. The journalist didn't want gossip or scandal. She wanted to write about my story as a message of hope, a beacon for other women who had been made invisible by the families that should have protected them. Rosa asked if I was interested in talking to her. I looked out the window at the mountains my grandfather had loved, the mountains he had given to me, so I could finally breathe freely without the weight of my family's indifference crushing my chest. "Give her my number," I said. The light had found me at last, and I was ready to share it with the world. And so April's story comes to an end, but in many ways it is only the beginning. She spent 35 years believing she was invisible, believing she was somehow less worthy of love than her sister, believing that no matter how hard she worked or how much she achieved, she would never be enough for the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally. It took losing her grandfather to discover that she had never been invisible at all. The one person who truly mattered had seen her the entire time. He had watched her grow into an extraordinary woman. He had collected evidence of her accomplishments like precious treasures. And when he knew his time was running out, he made sure to leave her not just an inheritance of money and property, but something far more valuable, the knowledge that she had always been worthy of love. April chose grace over revenge. She could have destroyed Hannah in court. She could have pressed criminal charges and watched her sister face the full consequences of her cruelty. But April understood something that Hannah never will. Revenge is a chain that binds you to the person who hurt you. Forgiveness, even when it is undeserved, is the key that sets you free. April did not forgive Hannah because Hannah earned it. She released that burden because she refused to carry it any longer. And in doing so, she finally stepped into the light her grandfather had always promised would find her. This story is for every woman who has ever felt invisible in her own family. For every daughter who worked twice as hard and received half the recognition. For every sister who was expected to be strong while someone else was allowed to be fragile. For every woman who looked around the dinner table and wondered why her accomplishments were never celebrated the way others were. You are not alone. Your feelings are valid, and your worth is not determined by whether your family chooses to see it. I want to hear from you now. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your family? Have you ever loved someone who seemed incapable of loving you back the same way? Have you ever had to walk away from people who should have protected you in order to finally protect yourself? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and there are thousands of other women watching this video who need to know they are not the only ones who have felt this way. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply say, "Me too," and let someone else know they are not alone in their pain. If April's journey touched your heart today, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this every week, stories about women who overcome impossible circumstances, women who find their strength after years of being told they were weak women who finally learned to love themselves after a lifetime of being unloved by others. When you subscribe and turn on notifications, you become part of a community of women supporting women, lifting each other up, and reminding each other that our worth is not defined by those who fail to see it. Please take a moment to hit the like button if this story moved you. That simple action helps more women find these stories when they need them most. And share this video with someone you love, someone who might need to hear that they too are a gem hidden in darkness, waiting for the light to find them. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Thank you for opening your heart to April's story. And thank you for being part of this beautiful community. Until next time, remember, you are seen, you are valued, and you are worthy of love. The light is coming for you too. You just have to be brave enough to step into it when it arrives. I will see you in the next story.